for joining us again. This is our second in our study on Daniel. This is our Wednesday night Bible study. And as I told you in the last video, we're going to continue to do our Wednesday night Bible studies online. Some people have asked about that. They want us to continue to do it that way. And so we're going to do that. For the meantime, we're going to be doing it to an empty room, and you guys just watch online because of the coronavirus and the social distancing that's taking place. So we're going to continue to honor that and try to keep people safe best we can. But again, this is an online Bible study, so you can comment on Facebook, ask questions, and we'll have a dialogue together, and we'll study through the book of Daniel. Last video was an overview and an introduction. Today we're going to actually start chapter 1. There's actually 3 invasions that Babylon did of Judah and Jerusalem. The first was in 605 BC. This is the one that Daniel takes place in. This is the political climate, the military climate of the book of Daniel. If you look at Daniel chapter 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged us. The first invasion of Jerusalem from Babylon. The second is going to be in 597 BC. The third is in 586 BC. Look at verse 2. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar. Shinar is Babylon. It's the same name. But if you look, it says in verse 2, the Lord gave to Jehoiakim. Daniel believed in the sovereignty of God. And there's parallel passages to this, parallel chapters that are about 40 years apart that trace the giving of these royal vessels. Leviticus chapter 26, if you want to read that. Deuteronomy chapter 28, if you want to read that. This has come now after 841 years of warning. These vessels are taken, and you could kind of trace them through the Old Testament. Again, those passages, Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, are parallel chapters to Daniel 1, but about 40 years apart. And if you look, let me read to you in Isaiah chapter 39, verse 7. I want to read a verse to you. It says in verse 7 of Isaiah 39, and some of your sons who will issue from you, whom you will beget, will be taken away, and they will become officials in the palace of the king of Babylon. This is in Daniel chapter 1. I told you last week, Nebuchadnezzar, upon hearing that his father has gotten killed, goes back to Babylon, swings through Jerusalem, and picks up a lot of young men from Jerusalem, takes them back to Babylon. This was prophesied by the prophet Isaiah at least 75 or 80 years before it actually happened. And so these things are again proving the validity of God's word. Now, while Daniel is in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar is going to go back to Jerusalem 2 more times. You read about these in 2 Kings 24:6, 11, verse 11, verse 13, verse 15, verse 17. All that has to do with the first invasion. The second invasion takes place in 597 BC. Ezekiel is among these captives. Ezekiel gets taken back to Babylon. 592 BC, Ezekiel begins his prophecies, and God has Ezekiel stationed outside the palace in Babylon with the other refugees. So God is strategically putting prophets in place to minister to the people no matter what situation they find themselves in. Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 1 through 10. Jeremiah is left behind in Jerusalem. So they're contemporaneous. Daniel is in the palace in Babylon. Ezekiel is outside the palace in Babylon. And Jeremiah is left in Jerusalem to minister to those people who were left behind in Jerusalem. Jeremiah is basically a letter written to exiles prophesying 70 years in exile to the people who are left behind. Now, at this time, Daniel's about 23 years old during the second invasion. So we back that up in Daniel chapter 1, and he's still a teenager. But I'm just showing you how these progresses with the invasion. The third invasion is 586 BC. 586 BC is prophesied by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 27 verses 1 through 12. He prophesies it. And in the third invasion, we have what we call object lessons or pedagogical references. These are things that the prophets are actually doing to prove their point. For example, Jeremiah puts a yoke around his neck and walks through the city, kind of representing the yoke of bondage and captivity. Ezekiel builds a miniature city and then destroys the miniature city to show them what has taken place. These are the three invasions. But again, we're back in Daniel chapter 1 in 605. 605 BC, Daniel is taken away, 12 to 14 years old by this point, and you'll see kind of what happens, because I'm telling you, one of the things about Daniel and his friends is that they have more spiritual fortitude, more spiritual integrity than a lot of us possess. Look at verse 3, Daniel chapter 1, verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians. Verse 4, defect, it's just they're perfect. They don't. There's no problem with them. They're healthy guys. They're smart guys. And so he says, I want you to go out, pick some of those, and I want you to bring them into the palace. Daniel's is included in this. And he said, I want you to teach them everything Babylonian, language, culture, literature, everything that you can think of. I want you to teach these guys. Daniel's going to be in that group. When he talks about wisdom, he's actually in this context is talking about how to do a project start to finish. And so he's trying to get these guys to really do their bidding. Look at verse 4. Look at a word in here. Endowed with understanding. He says, I want you to give them wisdom. That's knowing how to get a project done. Then he says, give them understanding. That's how to apply the wisdom. That's how to apply the knowledge of getting things done. That's what he's talking about. He says, I want you to teach them the language. In this particular time, 605, it'd be cuneiform, writing with a stylus into clay, writing the letters, the cuneiform letters, the alphabet, into clay with a stylus. That's what he's talking about here. It's interesting to me because he's talking about writing letters in clay. Jeremiah then prophesies in Jeremiah 17:1, and he says that God is going to use an iron stylus to write on our hearts, so that it will not go away. It will not pass away. Look at verse 5. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they enter the king's personal service. In other words, you do this for 3 years, you get trained, you get healthy, you get everything that you need to know about Babylon, and then I'm going to give you a good job at the end. This is kind of like Stockholm Syndrome. It's brainwashing to the nth degree. And so here's the problem in this, though. The food that he's talking about serving, and this is going to set up this first big challenge for Daniel in the book of Daniel. The food that is part of it's all in a religious context. The food was first offered to idols, probably the god Baal, maybe the god Nebo. And so this food was offered in the context of a religious setting. So they're going to offer this food to the idols, to the gods, and then they're going to have this meal that takes place. Now, look at verse 6. Now, among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel. These are the guys that are in the palace getting trained. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Look at their names. 2 names end with El. That's Elohim, the name for God. And 2 names end with AH. That's for Jehovah, the names from God. Their names mean something to them. Satan wants to brainwash us. Satan wants to change us in every aspect of who we are. He starts here with their name. It's interesting that their Hebrew names, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, have significant meanings. Daniel means God will deliver us. Hananiah means God is gracious to us. Mishael means who is like God. His prophetic words will come true. And Azariah means God has helped us. So God has given them a name that is in some way, especially during these stories, going to prove his purpose. It's going to prove who he is. It's like his stamp on their life. But remember, all this is about this food issue. They're gonna teach them reading, writing, arithmetic, culture. They're going to teach them all these things. But then he says, "When you give them the king's choice food." Now look at verse 8, because verse 8 sets up the whole controversy here. Verse 8: "But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself." Note, I don't know if you noticed this or if it struck you, but look at what's happened here. Daniel's about 14 maybe at the most, at the oldest, and it doesn't bother him when they changed his name, even though he's got a significant name. It doesn't bother him when they forced him to learn Babylonian language. It didn't bother him when they forced him to learn Babylonian literature. But this issue of food, look what it says in verse 8 now. Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food. Well, what's the big deal about the food? What's the problem here? Because it's in the context of a religious setting. So in other words, Daniel didn't mind when they changed everything else about his life, but he wasn't going to change his worship. He wasn't going to change the fact that he served God. Now, this is a 14-year-old kid. At 14 years old, he purposed himself in his heart. He made up his mind beforehand, predetermined, that he was not going to give in and change his worship. That's a huge decision by a 14-year-old. How many of us make the same thing? In other words, the decisions that we make to honor God, keep our integrity, to honor his word, they're not fly by the seat of our pants decisions. They're not spur of the moment decisions. They ought to be predetermined decisions. What a purpose in our heart that we're not going to do anything that defiles our service to the Lord. I mean, we're Christians after all. We're stamped in his image. We're made in his image. Imago Dei, in his image. We represent him. We don't want to take the chance that we're put in a compromising situation where the devil wins the fight. Purpose in your heart before time, before it gets to that point that you're not going to defile him. But nevertheless, look at what Daniel does. He asks permission first. He doesn't just rebel. He doesn't just cause a big problem. He asks permission. And so he's going to ask permission to do something that puts a great big burden on himself and his friends. Look at verse 8. He asked permission from the commander that he might not do this. He might not defile himself. Now, look at verse 9. God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander and the officials. So God's still in control. Look at verse 10. The commander of the officials said to Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink, for why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king." He says, "Daniel, I hear what you're saying. Now, I've got this compassion for you. I feel you. I understand you." He said, "But if I don't feed you the king's food, but all these other kids I do. And then at the end of the time, if the king looks at you all and you guys look worse than the other kids, it's my head that's going to roll. I'm the one that's going to get executed." Look at verse 11. Remember, this is coming from, at most, a 14-year-old kid. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see." So Daniel says, I got a deal. He said, let's work out a deal. For 10 days, let us just drink water and eat vegetables. The Daniel diet, as people call it. Maybe that's the problem for our world and our overeating tendencies. Maybe we should just eat vegetables and drink water. But that's a whole nother lesson. But look what he says. Let's test this for 10 days. Let us eat what we want, feed them what the king wants. Look at us and observe us at the end of 10 days and see where we're at. So, verse 14. So he listened to them in this matter, the overseer did, and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the 10-day challenge, Daniel and his friends were better off than the rest of the youth. Look at verse 16. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. It's going to come in handy for him. Then at the end of the days, which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. So they're the guys that actually enter in this choice job that he has for them. Verse 20, as for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king considered them, or consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and all the conjurers who were in all his realm. And Daniel continued unto the first year of Cyrus the king. So Daniel is going to, he passed the test. God granted him wisdom. He understood visions and dreams even. And so he's going to work inside the palace. Remember how God's orchestrated this. There's been an invasion. Babylon has come and invaded the land of Jerusalem, the land of Judah. And he's got Daniel in the palace, excelling. God's blessing him. He's got Ezekiel outside the palace with the refugees outside the king's service. He's got Jeremiah back in Jerusalem dealing with the remnant that was left behind. God's got it orchestrated, and he's got them all put together. So Daniel is now ministering inside the palace to the king, and it gives us another date in verse 21. Look what it says. He kept this service, kept doing this until the first year of King Cyrus. And when we extrapolate these dates and look at all this, that's 539 BC. So from 605 BC, when Daniel is taken away, he stays in the king's employment, in the king's service, ministering inside the palace until 539 BC when Cyrus takes over. And then things will begin to change a little bit. But that's how chapter 1 shakes out. We're going to look at chapter 2 on Wednesday, and I'll post a video on Wednesday. But chapter 2 deals with Nebuchadnezzar. We're going back to his reign, and it deals with him having these visions. And Daniel, because God has blessed him, is going to go in and interpret the vision. So I hope you enjoyed our study time together. If you have any questions or comments, just comment on here, and we'll have Bible study together. But please stay up to date with us, and we're caught up now. This is what we talked about last Wednesday night. So now, starting Wednesday, it'll be new material even for the people that were here on Wednesday, and we'll start with chapter 2 Wednesday. So God bless you. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you tune into the video on Wednesday. Stay safe.